Welcome to Go Play Pause, the Go Play event we have this year because 2020 critically failed its charisma check. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight. I also like to pay my respect to elders past and present. Now, I'm so glad you could join us tonight. I'm your host, John Reid, one of the organisers of Go Play, a mini-con in Brisbane, Australia that in non-2020 years offers 2 days of role-playing games, board games and LARPs. For the latest news about Go Play, you can join our mailing list at goplaybrisbane.com.au. Go Play Pause, what we're doing tonight, is our opportunity to share knowledge and inspire you to play your best. Our first session tonight is all about world building, that art of creating a backdrop, a stage for our role-playing games to play out against. From the mundane to the fantastic, the worlds we build for our stories set the scene, they inform the narrative, and they create something for our characters to interact with and struggle against. For what is Superman if he's not from Krypton, Frodo if he's not from the Shire, or the Doctor if they're not from Gallifrey? And would an adventure be the same if Batman didn't fight crime in Gotham, if Vimes wasn't trying to stop Ankh-Morpork falling apart, or if Captain Mal wasn't trying to get paid in the verse? Building an imaginary world that lives and breathes in the minds of a group of role players is lots of fun and lots of work, and it's something we can all get better at. To help us improve our world building skills and to inspire us with their creativity, we've put together a panel of talented world builders this evening. Our first panelist is the Jermaine Gareth. Gareth Willcock has been running role-playing games for over 35 years with a special talent for improvised sessions. He's a member of the organising committee for Brisbane's Go Play convention and is a long-standing GM at the con. Gareth is also the author of the RPG Genre Cops, where players work to enforce the law at a land where all the genres of storytelling mash up against each other. And so, Gareth, what's the first imaginary world that captured your imagination and why?
I think like a lot of people growing up in this kind of climate, just with how readily accessible pop culture has just become since the 80s and so on. I have been affected by all the big ones, but the Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Doctor Who's a big influence on me. But the one that I think really had the most effect on me, that really captured my imagination, was the Discworld. Just because what started out as essentially just purely a parody of the fantasy genre grew and developed into a beautiful stew of being able to use any kind of genre or technique to look at various aspects of society, but it all works within one consistent, beautiful framework.
Fantastic. And our next panelist tonight is the learned Lois. Lois Spangler has over 25 years experience as a bilingual writer and editor, and not quite as many years experience as a playwright, a narrative designer, a game runner, and a sensitivity reader. She teaches historical Iberian fencing and translates 16th century texts on the side. So tell me, Lois, what's the first imaginary world that captured your imagination and why?
There's two. It turns out that they sort of hit at the same time. The first one is the world of Pern, the Dragon Riders of Pern. And back when I got into it, I was probably 12. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have anything like that. But what we did have was, mail-in stuff. And if I could remember the particulars, I would share them, but I can't. There was a mail group, and you could create your own character, and you could sort of apply for a dragon, and you could have these interconnected stories. So it was also a bit of fan fiction on the side. And the reason I liked the Dragon Riders was because you could see there's this, it looks like a fantasy story. It looks like a fantasy setting until you start reading just a little bit beneath the surface, and you're like, oh wait, these are colonists who got shipwrecked, had to struggle to survive, and their culture has grown and emerged and evolved out of that. And the other world that I absolutely love is Max Headroom. I come from a TV journalism background. My dad was in the style of Kerry O'Brien, Edward R. Murrow, that kind of journalist. So it was fascinating to watch this show that presupposed a single man with a single camera running around dealing with issues that are very relevant today. When back in the day, when all that stuff was coming out in like the late 80s, a news crew was actually huge. Like, you had an enormous truck that would then, would help, do all these complicated things. So my dad thought it was amazing. It was like, this is ridiculous. How could you ever do that? Just a man and his camera. How could that ever happen? And now, look at what we have today.
How we live. Thank you. And finally, we have the spectacular Steve. Steve Dee has been working professionally in the games industry for almost 20 years, working on games such as Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, Shadow of the Demon Lord, and Vampire the Requiem. He's won numerous awards for his freelance role-playing game work and is president of Tin Star Games. Their new game, Relics, A Game of Angels, is in stores now. And so, Steve, what's the first imaginary world that captured your imagination and why?
Well, Gareth briefly mentioned it. It was definitely Lord of the Rings, the Tolkien, but particularly The Hobbit, that really caught my eye. I mean, I was 12 or so when I read it, and it sort of goes to what Lois was saying about there was something that you could discover in it, which is a real thrill. In that because the book often has maps at the front, the version I did had, and that's not sort of, it's not even really mentioned. Like, it's not like this is a map. They don't tell you this is the map of the world, but later on you realize that the characters in the story are looking at that map and reading the information of it in Dwarvish, and you can actually sit down and do a cipher and figure out what every Dwarven letter is to what every English letter is, and then start reading the information. And that kind of discovery is just a really good way to pull you into something. And it was almost a game that you could play. And I think a really good world can be great for that, where they have these kind of Easter eggs and puzzles and layers that you can slowly peel back and realize more and more about them as you go. And that's a really good storytelling technique and a world building technique to build the surface, but all the layers beneath.
Great, thanks, Steve. And so tonight, we'll start with our panelists talking about different ideas for world building. And then after a fair while talking about that, we'll take some questions from you. Just type them into the chat window as you think of them, and we'll try and get them answered for you tonight. So, with no further ado, let's ask the first question of the night. So, Gareth, what makes a good world for a role-playing game?
That's a big question, and I hope you'll enjoy the next hour of my answer. But there's a key thing that needs to be remembered. There's a lot of discussion about how world building works for stories, for storytelling, for people writing novels, short stories, television series, movies, whatever. That is very different from role playing, because quite uniquely in role playing, you don't have, as the GM, full control over what is happening. And if you do, then I hope you've got players who enjoy that sort of thing. Because there is this element that you have players that need to interact with the world, a lot of things that are really useful thinking about for world building for stories doesn't apply, because you can't control the way you reveal the information. For example, Steve's talking about the Hobbit with the map at the front, and that joy of kind of exploring it and then going through the story and having those kind of realizations of what the map means, what's happening to the characters. As the author, you can control how that works. For a role-playing game, you need to think about what mechanisms you're going to use to have the players control how that comes out, how they discover how it all works. If you've written secrets deep in your setting that the players have no real way of working out, but the characters that they've created have no way of working out, then there's an entire part of your world that's never going to be interacted with. Obviously, there are ways that you can ameliorate this and push players towards it, give them tantalizing things to draw them through that. But uniquely in role playing, you have a whole other set of authors that you can draw upon to help build your world. And I think very uniquely in world building for role-playing games, you want a world where other people can be authors.
Lois, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, Gareth hit it 100% on the head. When I briefly dove into the world of doing PhD research on this stuff, there's a kind of literature called, well, there's an approach to literature called Bakhtinian dialogism. And the whole idea is, if you take a look at books from the 19th century, Charles Dickens, stuff like that, the author is very much sort of puppeteering the characters. The characters have certain things that they're going to say. The plot is very much mechanically assembled by the author, which is okay. That's a perfectly legitimate form of literature. But Bakhtin said, hey, let's take a look at Dostoevsky. What's he doing? And what Dostoevsky put together were stories where all of the characters in the story were not no character was privileged over another, and each character was a fully formed personality. So the story wasn't necessarily, here is the plot that I want to here's the plot that I want to tell you about because it has this theme and I want you to know what this theme is. It's, I'm going to let these people do this stuff that they're already in the process of doing, and then an event will occur and these people will react to each other because they have opinions and feels and drives. And my job is to not privilege myself as the author, but to report these things to you. Now, in a book, that's great. But Gareth pointed out very rightly that in a role-playing game, some of the characters are played by other people. So you, as the GM, cannot privilege yourself over the players. Just as if you want the game to run, you can't necessarily privilege the players over you. I mean, you know, there's always ups and downs, and there's always, you know, exchanges. But on the average, everyone is on an even keel, and you have to respect the decisions and the choices that the players make, and what that means for the character. And there is an art in finding a way to, you know, like a beautifully crafted world for a novel or a movie. It's beautiful to look at. It might have wonderful textures. It's like a mural. But for a role-playing game, what you have is a climbing wall, because you want to put things that your players can get engaged in and can move and change around and rearrange. And my personal favorite way of playing is collaborative. So like, if I'm running a plot and my players are like, we think you're up to something, and I'm like, yeah, what do you think I'm up to? And their idea is better than mine, that's the idea we're going with.
They need never know. And Steve, would you add anything to this question of what makes a good world for RPGs?
I think one thing I just want to echo is that what we've said over and over again is that world building is something that you fit to purpose. It depends on what you want to do with the world. That determines what world you build. And it shouldn't, I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing world building just in your head for fun, but world building has usually a purpose. And that's the sort of the goal. If the goal is to build a world that is fun to role-playing in, for role-playing, to role-play in, then that is your goal. And that is what you are building towards. The world is a service to that. It doesn't exist necessarily. And although, I mean, there are games that are some exceptions to this, but for me, I believe that the idea is to build the world to service what you want to do with it. And that's how I always like to approach things.
Thanks for that, Steve. So, Lois, what would you say you think the most important element of world building is?
Oh.
Or a very important one.
Well, yeah. As a sensitivity reader, one of the things that I do is, you know, I'll get people who are like, you know what, I'm writing about this kind of thing. It's not part of my cultural upbringing. I want to make sure that I'm doing this right and I'm doing this respectfully. And even the most well-intentioned people will write some whoppers. And it's not that they're mean, it's not that they're evil, it's not that they're ignorant. It's just that when you grow up in a particular cultural, it's very hard to see outside of it. So when I do occasionally, like, I'll do a developmental edit for a world build. So somebody will come to me and say, I want to build a world, but I want to make sure that I'm doing things well from the start. I'll say, okay, imagine a typical character, just a typical person in the middle of your world. Just imagine that person and describe them to me. It's getting better. So maybe it's like 7 times out of 10 now. But usually it's a white guy. And I'm like, okay. What happens if I ask you to imagine this person as brown and female, or as black and non-binary? What happens to your world when we think about that? And they'll be like, oh, and I'm like, yeah, because the whole key to like world building structures itself on a bunch of different what ifs. So, what if you have a bunch of a particular culture that grew up in that started existence in an Icelandic kind of environment. What does it mean when it comes to things like hospitality? Well, survival depends on hospitality. So these are probably people who, if it's a successful society, will have a custom of, if you come knocking on the door, no matter what, you'll be allowed in. If you come in and you're like, I need help, please help, instantly you're allowed in. Well, what does that mean for other things? What does that mean in terms of, can that be abused? How do you prevent abuse? And then you can sort of just play with that for a bit, and then that might spark some other ideas over here. I love using cork boards and cards. So you can have sort of thematic areas, and then you can look at how they interconnect, and the whys will start to organically build as you go.
That's great. That's great. Gareth, would you have anything to add to that? Important elements of world building?
I definitely think like that as Lois has said, trying to get a real feeling culture, and that understanding that there are different cultures from what was written by Tolkien in the 1940s, for example. If you're writing fantasy, there are different points of inspiration that you can use. But I also definitely want to echo Steve's that world building is fit to purpose. I think the most, the other really strong thing to consider is what kind of stories are you wanting to tell? What sort of things do you want your players to experience? What are you trying to suggest from this world that will draw people in who want to experience the thing that you want that world to provide? If you are 100% going, I want people to enjoy a world of like shadowy courtly intrigue, then setting it in some sort of insane faux Viking culture where every disagreement is a duel of arms might not be the best way of doing that. But maybe that is actually great. Maybe you could go, well, nobody wants to get into a big combat, so everything is this shadowy courtly intrigue to try and avoid the situation where you finally have to say, we have to settle this with axes. But that decision, making that explicit in the setting, is like a key part of getting the buy-in.
Thanks, Gareth. Now, Steve, I wanted to ask you, have you ever tried to create a world where the environment can be experienced differently by different characters?
I think that's part of what can make really, really interesting worlds, actually, in the sense that understanding that different cultures and different peoples and people with different backgrounds do see with different lenses. I think that's a really good way to understand how to represent different ideas. And that goes back to what we're saying about how world building for role-playing games is about tools for use. And one of the key things people want to do when they step into an RPG is experience a different point of view. So one thing that you want to do when you build role-playing game worlds is have worlds full of different points of view. And so in that situation, different concepts will have different meanings to different people. And Lois has again sort of touched on that, where something that is true in the frigid north will not be true somewhere else, and that can be a really interesting way to talk about culture and reflect both our world and human experience by going what is the lens that is applied to this part of the world by these kind of characters, and how do those lenses interact? I think that's something that I'm particularly fascinated in, because it's something that's it's a big part of human experience. It's a big part of things that art can explore, and it's something that role-playing games are perfect for examining, how people see and how they see differently.
Thanks, Steve. That leads on really nicely to a question I want to ask Lois. In terms of, Lois, how can we use the process of world building to explore and challenge our biases?
Oh, oof. So this starts leaning into the realm of research. If you want to, if you decide you want to start building a world that isn't 100% rooted in Western cultural experience, like you want a medieval world, but you don't want medieval France, even if it has dragons and wizards. That's not what you want. It depends on what you're looking to do, but go on Twitter, look for people of color or people from cultural regions that you're not familiar with, and pay attention to what they're talking about and the art that they're talking about. Read literature written by people who are from the cultures that you're interested in. For instance, if you wanted to set up a medieval Mesoamerican style world, I, as a Mexican American, say, yeah, definitely go for it. But do some good reading, like Miguel Lopez Portilla. He's got a lot of work that's translated into English and well translated. And you can learn so much good stuff just by reading that. And by learning the different ways that different peoples see the world. Like, for instance, one of the examples I give when I'm talking about Mesoamerican stuff is there is no, in the way that in the Western world we have this conception of like good versus evil, it's always, in Mesoamerican thought, these aspects are complementary. One drives the other, drives the other, drives the other, and it's not necessarily good and it's not necessarily evil. It is law and solidity and construction and safety, and then at the opposite end there's falling apart, there's danger, there's uncertainty. Both of those things are part of life, and there's a tension between the two that always has to happen. They're not necessarily enemies. And I know, like, sitting here, it's like, how do I even begin to think of the world through that lens? You can, with a bit of practice and some good reading lists.
Could you maybe give us a list of one or two good books for that, and we could post them on the Facebook page?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't do it now.
No, that's all right. No.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we'll do that afterwards. Wonderful. Thanks, Lois. And Gareth, I guess the question I want to ask you is, why would we do all this world building stuff when it takes so long to sort of write it all out and set it all up?
Yeah, so as Steve mentioned, there is a lot of joy in sort of world building by yourself. The thought exercises of trying to build something that works and functions, and has the crazy creative ideas that you're trying to get out. But I think one of the great advantages of role playing is that you do have other authors who sit down at the table with you. And a lot of times, I know that some people who may have grown up being used to Tolkien and kind of feeling the weight of like the Silmarillion behind everything, or reading Dragonlance and feeling like there's this entire cosmology that had to be created, or reading Dune and just going, oh wait, I have to do a whole ecology life cycle of things to make a world work.
Yeah.
You don't have to, and it can actually be supremely rewarding to have the bare outline of what you want to present in the world. Think in terms of like genres, easy hooks and things that you can pull players into, and then just ask questions of your players. As an example, I unfortunately it's on hold. I was running a Dungeon World campaign that was mostly completely off the top of my head. It's unfortunately on hiatus because a small human fell out of my wife. And that's consumed a lot of my life at the moment. But yes, I basically started off with your young adults, late teens from a tiny village. And it's all about kind of working out what your place of the world is as we kind of expand the scope from game to game. And your village is called Kettle, and just ask people questions about why is it called. They immediately needed to work out why it was called Kettle. So suddenly, we are a village on the side of the caldera of an extinct volcano, which has hot springs, which provide a healing, like an ingredient for a healing elixir, a folk remedy. But unfortunately, recently the waters have been receding. Why is that? Oh, well, it's because the goddess who is the namesake of the village has obviously withdrawn her support. Suddenly there's a faith crisis. One player goes, oh, I'm definitely playing a priest of that faith. And just suddenly it was like, okay, tell me about the god. Who's the goddess? Why are they important? And then suddenly it was like, oh, well, we're a volcano. It's a healing mixture. So she's a god of fire and healing. And suddenly we just went, oh, fire and healing. So obviously, all medicine is done by cauterizing wounds. The special symbol of the faith is the I've forgotten the word, but it's like a needle scalpel thing for closing off wounds. And suddenly this whole religion just suddenly appeared out of nowhere. And that's none of that. I walked into that setting thinking of. It was just a series of switches. Thank you. A series of questions that I asked the players, and because they were buying into it, because they were like, I need to work out where my character fits into this. It's all part of this collaborative world building. And as long as a very, very useful tip is to try and have maybe a genre or a thing that you're going for, so there's an easy hook. All of the world building can then latch on to that kind of basic idea of what it was. It's a small village in the middle of nowhere, so nobody is going to be playing an aristocrat or, a holy knight. Or we decided, I think they went, oh, it's a volcano, so we're in the middle of a desert region, so no one's going to be a sailor or anything. We even had like some discussion about whether everybody would know what the sea was. I was like, no, they've got books, they can read. Yeah, and this is not only something that can happen in your first session, but as a process that carries on through your games. We had a situation again in this same setting. This is a technique that I'm giving out for free. It's kind of a fun idea. I basically got a bunch of cards, a stack of cards, and I had a situation where for particular dice rolls or particular situations, I can't remember exactly what the triggers were. It was like, okay, you get to name the tarot card that's in this setting, and based on what just happened and what it means. And then because I demanded that they give me the number and the suit of it as well, we had for those who are familiar with tarot, the major arcana were part of the minor arcana, as it were. Every minor arcana is a named thing. They gave me the suits, and we ended up with dew, stone, smoke, seeds, and shadow as the 5 suits, which then became the 5 elements of the world. And then suggested this whole cosmology that came out of it, and the thing is becoming an in-world thing, the essences deck, and you can actually draw from it and use it as a character thing or as a tool for the game. It's just like, oh god, I've drawn the Forgotten Song again. Oh, I hate this card.
Would you have ever thought of that on your own?
No, absolutely not. And this is the great thing, because we have the ability that you just don't get you don't really get in novel writing, you don't get in computer role-playing games, you don't get when you go to the cinema. You can just have brilliant ideas just come out of nowhere that you would not have thought of before, that then takes your game in a new direction. And because your players are contributing to the world, there's this automatic buy-in. Things mean a lot more to them now that they've bought into it and have helped create it. You know, you can say, oh, everybody knows that the Nazgul are the most fearsome servants of Sauron, and you're just like, yeah, okay, whatever. Who's Sauron? But you know, if somebody goes, okay, you've just seen your father be murdered. Who murdered them? It's like, oh, well, obviously this guy, and then suddenly it's just like, oh no, you know, Uncle Brutus, we've got to get that guy. So yeah, you don't have to do a lot of preparation to make a living, breathing world that your players will be invested in, is what I'm trying to say.
Thanks, Gareth. Steve, do you have any techniques to facilitate collaborative world building?
Most of what I've been doing recently has been building games themselves. So I tend to do a lot of it on my own, but I try to leave gaps in those settings for people to fill things in. I always try to make sure that whatever scale of the world is, there are ways that the players can be incredibly important and shape their world and have power, because nobody wants to be someone who has absolutely no agency over a situation. I tend to write worlds that are in conflict or hitting a tipping point so that small actions can have an enormous impact. And that is a way that you can get, but it's not so much the same thing as inventing who the Nazgul are, but you know, you could, if you write something like the Nazgul, you can put in a prophecy that, you know, that they can be killed by no man or something, and have a nudge to the GM that, have you got any female non-binary characters? This is your chance to come in and rewrite that prophecy and things like that. You can put tilt points into your settings so that any adventurer or any GM can just go, oh, that's perfect. This is a way that we can break the world and change the world and things like that. And that's a sort of a different kind of inviting collaboration. And I think in character generation as well, like that, you want to give people the tools to make something that feels powerful and distinct. And that's something we did a lot in, that people really warm to relics. We have a mechanic where you get to decide what your angel created on Earth in the whole history of creation, and what myths and legends they might have inspired, or what historical events they might have caused or averted. And people really love that, to go, oh yeah, you know, I invented the platypus, I invented the feeling of loneliness. And that just gives you an enormous sense of, again, what Gareth was saying, it lets you connect to the world. So I think it's really important. I mean, there's a reason why we sort of don't want to give the players the keys to the kingdom, but that is a thing you should resist, because when they feel powerful, they feel connected.
Thank you, Steve. And Lois, do you have any techniques for helping people build worlds together rather than just have the GM in an ivory tower?
Honestly, it's all been covered. Like, you know, there are games that lend themselves to this. The Fate system lends itself to this. But if I'm running a game, and first of all, one of the most important things to remember is that when you are world building, you are never finished. You never finish building the world. So I'm keeping an eye on the questions because I'm being incredibly naughty. But there was a question about, you know, well, what happens when you get people who come in late who weren't part of that original building session? Well, the world isn't finished. They may have ideas, you know, they may come in and, you know, like was said before, they identify a gap and they're like, well, what can happen in this gap? And your job as the GM is to be, you know, Harold method improv and say yes and. The best things happen with yes and. It can be difficult, especially if you're the GM and you've done a lot of work on the world building. You can start to develop an ownership over it, where you might be like, don't touch. But I guarantee you, like, this was something I learned as a playwright. I might write the script, but I'll hand it off to a director, and the director has a whole worldview and experience that I have no access to. And then the director will take my work, put it through their lens, and then they'll talk to the actors. And the actors have their own personal experiences that I have no access to. And all of a sudden, in rehearsals, they're finding laughs that I didn't know existed in my work. They're finding moments of deep poignancy that I thought were throwaway lines. So I guess if I could give a fundamental skill, it's listen in good faith. When somebody has an idea, don't think that they're trying to wipe you out. Don't think that they're trying to look cooler than you. Come to the table in good faith and listen. Because when you do, the things that Gareth was describing just happen naturally. Everybody gets excited, you know? There's this whole, oh, and at that point, the problem, the pinch point is getting all the ideas on paper and making sure you don't forget anything.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lois. And Gareth, now you've come at all of this from a fairly improvisational kind of background. Did you have to train yourself to get into an improvisational headspace?
I think it's not something that comes easily, especially if a lot of your experience may have been with a lot of very traditional, GMing, like published adventures, published maps, the battle map on the table, pre-picked out your minis, and for those familiar with D&D, generating encounters based on challenge rating and making sure all the numbers check out, or whatever. But I think it does kind of boil down to, as Lois said, there are some systems that really help you with regards to improvisation. I believe that any system, once you feel confident with it, you can easily just run off the top of your head and rely on your players being nice and ignoring the bits that may not fit together exactly perfectly as the system wants you to. But the nice thing about this current generation of sort of more story focused or narrative focused games is that there's this deliberate fuzziness for this this improvisation, for this collaboration to happen. And I think it's just confidence in being able to say, look, I can make this work, and for stuff that doesn't, I am happy to just drop out of character and negotiate directly with players. That's completely fine at any time. If I was reading a thing the other day on a forum about people just going, yeah, but I had to work so hard to make the mechanics work so the bad guy was able to escape the players at the midpoint instead of them killing him. And I was just like, why didn't you just turn to your players and say, hey guys, this is the bit where the villain escapes. Okay, everybody's familiar with this trope. Don't worry, you'll be able to get him on, there'll be a final confrontation, but this is the bit where he escapes. What is your cool line that you're going to say to swear revenge, or I'll get you, or whatever. And having the confidence to be able to pull those levers and just rely on the fact that your players will give you things and that you can put the links together and make things work. Having that confidence is sometimes just enough. But yeah, there is a lot of experience sometimes that you just need to do it a few times before you start, I think, being able to 100% go, okay, let's just rely on our conversation and make something great.
Thanks, Gareth. Steve, I want to circle back to something you were saying about relics. In that it sounds like you've explicitly given the players permission to make the world their own. Have you found this is an important thing to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's particularly important, I think, for relics, because relics is really about responsibility. That's one of the main themes of the game. So very much the idea is that God has abandoned creation, and it is up to you to sort of decide what happens next. And so it was really important in that to give everyone these just enormous amount of power and the ability to take on those kind of levers and pull them themselves. But it can depend on exactly the setting and the story that you want to tell as well.
Thanks. And Lois, I wanted to ask, we've talked about bias and such. What would be one piece of advice for something you'd want to watch out for when you're creating a world? Something you'd want to avoid?
Yeah. All right. So I'll give you this. Well, I'll give you a link, but you can look it up and you can find it easily. There is an essay by Bell Hooks called "Eating the Other," and it's all about the ugly tendency for white writers to use ethnicity and exoticism as delicious flavors and backdrops. It's a very specific kind of objectification. It's like, I want to make this. I want to create a group of desert peoples who are, hardy and are very self-reliant. So all of a sudden now you're looking at Bedouin stuff, and you pick a couple of, telltale signs of what a Bedouin looks like, and you're like, haha, here is my new nation. The things that people do and the things that people believe come out of centuries of living in a particular way. And to sort of put that on as a quick little mask, or to put it up on a building to make that building look like it's not your traditional, European thing. Don't be lazy. Don't be lazy. And the thing is, like, setting aside lazy, like, forget about that. Don't be boring. Like, don't be boring. There's so much exploration you can do. Just like, for instance, if you're like, all right, well, I want to create a people who, again, are, I talk about Mesoamerica. I can comfortably talk about that without like making huge mistakes. So, all right, well, why did the Mayans do the things they did? Why was their agriculture so weird? Oh, it's because most of their cities were built on the remains of the crater that was formed by the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. So instead of having, a good flat bedrock surface, it's all porous limestone. So soil falls through the limestone, water collapses through these limestone holes and collects in these deep grottos filled with water. How you can't grow a normal crop on that. Oh, well, that's why they do some of the things they do. And that's why their buildings look the way they do. And particularly that's why these deep cenotes, I forget what the word is in English, but it's these beautiful sinkholes, they just go hundreds of feet deep. I mean, there's just these columns of emptiness that go down into the limestone, and then there's water. And those were considered entries into the underworld. Well, there's a good reason. So don't be boring. If you're going to start building something and you have that first impression thought, that's okay, write it down. But do some extra thinking around it, and don't I don't know what profanity levels we are in, but don't half hind quarter it.
Yeah. No half-baked world, please.
Exactly.
Can I ask a question, Lois?
Go for it.
Do you think that like a big problem with these sort of creation of these particular cultures in a lazy fashion is usually because the person creating them is not really expecting that culture to be a point of view. They're the culture that's being looked at from another thing. You're not supposed to be playing from that or being represented from within that culture looking out.
I think that's super insightful. I'd have to do some thinking about that, but on its face, I think that is a seriously good insight. I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying. Yeah.
Thank you, both of you. Well, thank you, everyone. Actually, this has been fascinating. But I think we should go into some questions from our viewers. I've got the first one here. What I'll do is I'll ask the question, and whoever feels like they've got a good answer, jump in. So Peter Blake asks us, what should you do if players find inconsistency or contradiction in the world that you've built? Go in, Lois.
Make it a plot point.
Yeah.
So like, if your players are like, hey, hey Lois, didn't you say like last week that there was no such thing as a queen in this particular nation? I'm like, I did, didn't I? And I'm like, well, here you go. You found a record of a queen in this particular nation. But this nation's historians, they absolutely will swear up and down till they're blue that there's never been a queen. What does that mean? You talk about it while I'm going to go make some notes.
I like it. I like it. And then, okay, so David Jacobs asked us, where is the dividing line, in brackets, if there is a hard one, close brackets, between drawing inspiration from real world cultures and exploitation and appropriation?
I think Lois kind of answered that a bit just before with the spice versus the research and the laziness versus the effort. And I think care and yeah, attention to detail and are going to be your watchwords there. And ask for help is the other thing.
Yeah, one of the tricks that I use very briefly is, like, for instance, if somebody that I'm working with, I know that they're Catholic, I'll say, all right, well, if you can imagine an outsider group of people taking a look at communion wafers and going, oh, this is cool. Wine-flavored communion wafers. Do they taste good with cream cheese? That's great. You know, for a practicing Catholic, that's really not cool for a variety of reasons. And so if you can be gently transgressive with a little bit of an example to help people sort of go, oh, okay, all right. I can see why people get upset about certain things. That makes a little more sense to me. Then you can get them to start thinking that way.
I think an easy way might be, as I think we were sort of discussing before, when the line being where it stops being like an actual depiction of a real working live culture with its own sets of beliefs and worldview and way of behaving, and like a thematic point that you need to make. Oh, I need a desert tribe, so there's Bedouins. There we go. They're the desert people. Done. Instead of actually,
or a collection, or a collection of like cool qualities that look like they're fun but have no organic connection to one another.
Okay, thank you guys. And Graham Harris has a tricky question for us. What do you do when your players want to break the rules of your world? For example, he lists a world with limited networking, but they want to play a networked AI. Following up with, I want my players to have fun, but I don't want them to have ultimately unsatisfying characters.
It's definitely a big question that is part of a lot of role-playing games, and indeed games in general. There is a sense that we want to be able to break the rules so we can easily win, and there's this antagonist element of players want to be able to take over and sometimes get away with anything. And you have to be able to temper that a little bit. But I think we talked earlier about good faith. And if you go to your players and go, look, this is the reasons why I put this in the world, like break out of the world explanations and go, look, this is why I put that in. Why do you want to break that? What's interesting to you about breaking that? Can we do what Lois said and make it a plot point? Can you be the only one that works that? Why is that interesting? And how can we also, like, what is the consequences of that? Because it's that sense of, yeah, like, okay, maybe you are, but then everyone else wants what you have. You're the only person who can do it. Therefore, isn't everybody going to be hunting you? And you can then go, let's make that really interesting. Players usually have a reason for what they want. And sometimes you have to drill down because you're not quite on talking about the right sort of thing. I was trying to make a dark, sort of horrifying world, and I had this sort of character, a guy who was playing one of the robots in the Shadow of the Demon Lord universe, and we had this complete cross purposes thing where I was sort of going, well, just to make the world kind of grim and gritty, everyone treats robots kind of mean and something, and he was like, well, I'm going to just be, he started sort of plotting to get back at these people. And I thought I didn't really quite get what he was going for. So then we had to sit down, and I realized that he was actually, no, I want to build my character to be, I've been really offended by this. It's not just a throwaway thing for me. It's something I want to be really important, that they're not, you know, the other criminals in this world aren't respecting me as a robot. I'm going to actually destroy them for being racist. And we just had to talk about what our actual goals were with the story, because before we were doing that, we were just blocking each other. And so I think, yeah, be aware that players usually have another motivation. And it might even be a bit of an anxiety thing as well. Like I talk about this in Relics, is that players want to feel safe as well as special. And sometimes the things that they want, the powers that they want, the ability to break the rules that they want, is because they're afraid that if they don't have that, they'll be railroaded or taken, they'll lose control, or the GM will kill their character or something like that. So a lot of it is actually going, let's actually figure out what our emotions are, and, you know, say, look, I'm not going to hose you if you don't have this. You know, I'm going to make this interesting, and this is why I want to do it, and let them tell you what their concerns are. And it's if you get down to what's all behind it, that comes back to the very first point about purpose. Like, what are we doing here with this world? Why are we talking about it? What are our emotions? Let's find that out, and then we can figure out the best way to do it.
Yeah, and we can all build something fun and deep together.
Yes.
Yeah, listening in good faith.
Yeah.
Listening in good faith. It's a wonderful phrase. Let's see. Now we've got another question here, probably our last question for the night. Henry asks, how do you go about depicting a non-human society or culture that feels genuinely non-human without relying on a single hat for the species or making them all Spartans with horns?
I think that what you need to do first is pick something that is a given for humans, that like a thought or a worldview or an idea that's just a given that everybody assumes, and then just say this culture does the opposite and there is no explanation. It's not rationalized. It's not anything, in the same way that we might not have like a really good reason for some of the deep-seated assumptions we have, and then build a culture out from that.
I think something we sort of danced around a bit is that this idea of start with a question and then keep asking questions. And you can, if you do keep asking, you'll get more of that depth in those layers, and you'll say, well, you know, and you'll also allow for the fact, well, most people do this as well, which can give you those different layers. Like there are other people who approach it differently and things like that. And I think, yeah, throw away your assumptions, ask really big questions, and then keep asking questions and keep going, well, what does that mean? What does that mean?
The building on what's been said, you know, and specifically building on what Gareth said, if I were going to try to build a non-human race, I'd be like, okay, what makes this race not human? What makes this species not human? Is it that they only breathe underwater? Like they can't actually breathe oxygen. They have gills. They have to draw in oxygen through, or do they even need oxygen? What if they actually need nitrogen? They'd probably be okay in this atmosphere, but what does that mean for them? What does that mean in terms of the way that they view life and the way that they view death and the way that they view like the really big things that humans worry about? Life, death, love, leaving a legacy. What does that mean given, you know, this particular species survives on nitrogen? What does that mean? Well, that means a certain kind of planet and a certain kind of formulation that's probably, now I'm making stuff up. I'd actually have to do the research, but that means that the planet is usually very hot. What does that mean in terms of like a life cycle? Maybe their life cycles are really accelerated. So you have a species that goes from birth to childhood to adulthood to death in the space of what we would consider 20 years. What does that do? What does that do to your perspective? What happens?
I also
keep
think
asking questions.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say that the thing is that I kind of feel that that you might have a situation where you'll just end up with something that's completely explicable through human means, and it might just be a situation where it's just like, well, if a human society grew up here, they'd just be humans. I think that if you want something that really feels non-human, you've got to take something that's human, take it away without explaining it at all, and then go, and now this is how a society based on that functions, or that has that assumption functions, with all the things that Lois is talking about, with these other questions, and maybe you'll get something that really doesn't feel human, that doesn't feel right.
That's just a good rule in general, is that we often, coming back to that question about doing all the work and being Frank Herbert, not everything has to make sense. Not to you, not to your players, not to the audience, because a lot of things don't make a lot of sense to us. There is a lot of absurdities in reality, and contradictions and things like that. And you can absolutely embrace that and just go, well, this is just how it is. And now what does that mean? Can I just also say, we've got a lot of really good questions here. Maybe we could copy them and some of us could go into the Facebook and answer them afterwards or something.
I think that'd be fantastic. Yeah, we'll continue some of our discussions on the Facebook group. That'd be great. So that'll leave me with just a couple of quick finishing questions. Gareth, Middle Earth or Westeros?
I am unfortunately one of the people who has deliberately avoided Game of Thrones, so I think I have to default to Middle Earth.
Absolutely.
Also, it's also not an American, so kidding.
Sold.
Kidding.
And Lois, Hogwarts or Narnia?
Narnia.
Narnia. Good, simple answer. Steve, Forgotten Realms or Eberron?
Oh, Eberron, definitely.
Clank me, baby.
Very much more interesting world, and a good example of taking real world stuff and reflecting on them, because it's about an interregnum, a period between the wars, which is just a fascinating kind of time to explore. So yes, Eberron.
Thanks, Steve. Well, that's about all we have time for tonight. Let me start by thanking our wonderful panelists, Gareth, Lois, and Steve. Gareth, how can people find out more about you?
I've been trying to avoid that. There's been court orders put out. But please keep up to date on all the events. Hopefully we will have more of these if we can't have a convention, or maybe if we do have a convention, we'll try and have more of these for Go Play. And I hope to continue being part of this wonderful convention and process.
Sounds great. Lois, how can people find out more about you?
You can visit my website, storytrade.net, but it's very, very sword historical fencing research heavy. Mm-hmm. You might find it fun. Yeah. And I occasionally will post stuff on Twitter. You can find me at incognitiously, which will get spelled out at some point.
Thanks, Lois. And Steve, how can people find out more about you and Tin Star Games?
Yeah, I am pretty much Tin Star Games everywhere. So it's tin like the metal, all one word, at Tin Star Games on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and tinstargames.com. You can find a whole bunch of my games there, cheap ones. There's a game all about building settings called It Is Forbidden, which is for sale on itch, and a bunch of free games as well. So
also by Elevator Pitch and Genre Cops.
Yes, you can find a link to Genre Cops there as well, which you can get from The Game Crafter by Gareth. Someone in the chat is asking where will these questions be answered on Facebook? I presume in the Go Play group.
Yep, Go Play Brisbane. On Facebook, that's where we'll be. And if you're all confused, just drop us a line on the goplaybrisbane.com.au site with a contact form there. You can ask us questions through that, and we will direct you to the correct place. So, as well as thanking our wonderful panelists tonight, I'd also like to thank Andrew Smith for working behind the scenes to make this event happen tonight, Nadia Bagley for running our Facebook page so well, and Leith Reed for her help with the Go Play website and copywriting. And last of all, I'd like to thank all of you for sharing your time with us tonight. This event's an experiment. If you've had fun tonight and you'd like to see more events like this one, let us know on Facebook at Go Play Brisbane, or leave us a message at goplaybrisbane.com.au. Sign up for our mailing list while you're there. I'm John Reid. Hope to game with you all again soon. Until next time, game on. Good night, everybody.